Okay, so as we approach the end of 2021, after all the changes that happened in this sort of post-COVID era with the bike industry, I wanted to go over some of these budget bike comparisons again. I have redone the spreadsheet that I did last year because there were so many changes I couldn't simply update that one. I had to just start from scratch. So this one goes a little bit deeper, and then I think having ridden 2 different bikes and having met more mountain bikers, I've just gotten a lot more opinions and sort of mental data on the quality of these parts, the performance of these budget bikes. So for my spreadsheet, it is budget full suspension bikes in sheet 1. If you go to the bottom here and click sheet 2, you will find the hardtails. In both sheets, you will see this color coordination here, and the meaning of each color is denoted on the far right here. So first we have a standout spec for price. So if we're just going off the cheapest bike with very bad parts, well, we go to the next cheapest bike and it has hydraulic brakes instead of mechanic brakes. So a standout part for such a low price. And then we have this orange for questionable spec for price. So if we go up into these more expensive bikes, we really don't want to be seeing SRAM SX and X Fusion, as well as wire bead tires and standard seat posts, non-dropper. Most helpful for people would be the best value bike and worst value bike color indicators. So best value, things like Polygon, and there's one Vitus here for full suspension. And for the hardtails, it's mostly Vitus bikes and Nuke Proof, which is basically from the same company. And for worst value bikes, you have a variety of things, but Diamondback is kind of the king of giving you less for your dollar. And then really importantly, these geometry numbers, I'm only listing head tube angle, and it's on you to look up the rest of the frame design, but it's going to give you just that base to work from. So if you see sort of like a trail bike, maybe even an all-mountain trail bike, but it still has some kind of really steep cross-country type number on it, that'll give you a little red flag to know maybe the rest of that bike isn't designed very well. Maybe the frame has a more old school design that you don't want to go with if you're doing like 140 mil suspension. And then for you more aggressive riders, it'll indicate these more enduro numbers, these aggressive 65s and 64s. And then over time, I wanted things to be a little less black and white and kind of just give a little bit more information. So I added these sort of soft values, these above average value, below average value. So we're not talking about a horrible bike or an amazing bike. It's just going to indicate that you should look into it. If it's above average, oh, that's good. Look into what makes it that way. If it's below average, see what that compromise is. Maybe it's compromise that you personally don't care about. A perfect example of a below average bike that you still want to look at would be something like the Commencal Meta TR. Technically a well-spec'd bike, it just doesn't come with a dropper, and the fork is actually coil instead of air. But it is the cheapest suspension bike that's going to hit that 150 millimeter fork, and it actually has decent brakes, unlike almost all the bikes on this list. And of course, it's the first one that dips into that 64. So basically, slightly enduro. I guess you would call that an all-mountain bike. And then, sort of by the same token, you have this sort of light orange tan color. I don't want to inject too much of my opinion. I'm trying to mostly use other people's opinions, common conceptions, industry standards. But there will be things where, because it's my spreadsheet, like I'm going to call out X Fusion where I see it, and I'm going to call out sort of Tektro brakes when I see them, etc. One of the things I really like about this spreadsheet isn't so much this red and blue, which is telling you sort of like what's so bad, what's so good, what the sort of averages are for direct-to-door brands and what the averages are for your brick-and-mortar traditional bike brands. What I really like is the sort of flow of seeing how brands progressively spec their bikes. So you can see as the bikes are getting better and better, they're sort of upgrading different things. Maybe this one has a better drivetrain, but their suspension still stuck, or the opposite. Or maybe this one is like a really good bike, but the brakes are actually really crappy. And then you hit these sort of break points, like 2000 is a perfect break point. For the Siskiyou T7, which is the bike that I just bought, you can see on the spreadsheet, it's just a clean spec across the board, and it's the first brand to really do that. The $1,800 bikes, the Siskiyou D7, that one's not tubeless ready, and then the Mythique VR, that one's a really good bike as well, but it has the X-Fusion suspension, and it has some of those frame problems that I talked about when I owned that bike. So there's still tiny compromises there, but when you get to 2000 for that Siskiyou T7, there's no compromise aside from the brakes are kind of soft if you're a really aggressive rider. But if we're talking about most budget buyers, they're more in that beginner journeyman level, you're not actually going to have a problem with that. It's more so if you're pushing that bike past what that budget would usually indicate, and that's just on you, sadly, to upgrade the brakes. I mean, most of this list has some pretty bad brake problems as far as value goes. So I don't really want to go over the bad bikes too much. You can look at those and see some of the common connections of what makes a bike bad. Like I'm simply never going to recommend SRAM SX. The entire industry knows it. The entire mountain bike community knows it. I've seen it in person. So that's just the way it's going to be. You can do your own research on that if you want, but you will find that once you start Googling around that drivetrain is just inferior. But what I do want to talk about is the bikes that you are more likely to get, the things that look good on this, and what you might change or want to look at if you are getting those bikes. So obviously for the D7, it's a lot like the T7, and it's a really good spec bike. It just doesn't come with tubeless tires. It comes with wire bead tires. But the rims, I believe, are pre-taped, so you're technically ready to go. You just need to make that tire upgrade, which is kind of expensive, maybe like $50 per tire, so you're adding $100 total. But I mean, hey, that's still only totals up to $1,900, and you're ready to go with a bike that's very, very similar to the Siskiyou T7. And ironically, the brakes on the D7, the Shimano 201s, those probably aren't too bad. Like the MT 401s that I had on my Mythique VR, I like those more than the Tektro brakes that are on my T7. So even the braking's pretty good. Like I don't know to Keller here. You don't have to upgrade it if that's something you do want to upgrade, but that's pretty good for that price. And then for the Mythique VR, we already went over that. I had that bike. It's a really good spec. It comes with those great brakes. I think they work really well out the box. That one has, obviously here, suspension that's a bit inferior, and you may want to think about if you want to upgrade that over time or just deal with suspension that has kind of poor damping, doesn't have really good rebound control and stuff like that. My big thing with the Mythique VR is that it has that annoying frame design issues with the dropper insertion, but I can't say that that's going to be a problem for everybody. I ride a bit differently, a bit aggressively, so I don't want to force that issue onto people. But when it comes to suspension that has kind of poor damping, everybody should be made aware of that kind of problem. Moving forward, if you get the T7, that is like almost a perfectly spec'd bike, especially for that price. This is the bike I'm riding now. Again, the brakes are the only weak point, but only for a journeyman rider that's leaning into sort of expert riding. Beginner's not going to notice it, and most journeymen might not even notice it. Go up $100 more with the Mythique VRS, same frame. I won't mention those issues again. Similar suspension, same rear shock. I really don't like that. At least they upgrade the fork, And that's really nice because once you get to 140 millimeter, the 32 millimeter stanchions start to get pretty wobbly. So it's nice to have those 34 millimeter stanchions to get more stiffer, consistent performance out of that fork. And again, very good brakes, and the whole spec is actually quite nice. Also, I do want to go back and mention the T7 that I'm riding now. The fork that it has is 32 millimeter stanchion. Again, beginners, journeymen, not going to notice it. But if you're like me and you're riding it a bit past what it's maybe built for, you're going to notice that a bit along with the brakes. You're going to notice the brakes a bit more, and I would tackle that first. But if you want to ride it really aggressively and just kind of cheap out on the bike originally, you can find a used fork, 34 mil, 36 mil, something like that, slap it on there, and you can ride that bike extremely aggressively as it is. Moving up to the VRX, you can see the color differentiation there. So this one gets away from that X-Fusion suspension. Great drivetrain. The RockShox Monarch doesn't have the lockout, but that's fine. And then you get that. This is the cheapest bike with the Marzocchi Bomber. Great fork, 34 mil at that 140 mil travel, and MT 501 brakes. So slight brake upgrade. That's going to be a great aggressive bike. Only thing to mention here is those frame issues. So look into it if you want. Watch reviews, read reviews in the mountain bike media. I think the problem with the Mythique VRX necessarily, even with its great build, is that it's between the Siskiyou T7 T8, and it's a bit closer to that T8 price. So, in my opinion, you might as well save that. It's only $200 more, and boom, you're bumping up to SLX. The rear shock is that Fox Float, fork is the Fox 34. So that's a really great spec. Again, with Polygon, one of the places they save money is the brakes. Same thing even with the T8, those Tektros. Whereas the VRX, those MT501s, are going to do you a lot better in my opinion. And I don't want to skip over the Giant Trans 3, especially for people who are not comfortable with the direct-to-door brands. They want to buy from a shop, from a dealer, have that warranty, that service plan, stuff like that. That's a great option if you need to go that route. You're still getting that Fox Float rear shock, Marzocchi Bomber Z2. Brakes are still good. VRX has slight brake upgrade, but those brakes will be usable. I like those Shimano's. Dior instead of SLX, so it is what it is. Basically, you just think about it the way as you're paying for that brick and mortar brand, the dealer service and warranty. And now we hit an interesting point where we've already seen our really good, like 140 mil, 130 mil trail bikes, and we hit this swath of kind of poorly spec'd bikes. And the only one that's really standing out here, you have this Canyon Neuron 6, but it has a 30 mil stanchion fork, even though it's 130 mil. Like, I can't believe they make that fork. So it's kind of like a pseudo cross-country, down-country bike, but it's not even that well spec'd. So I would be skipping that and either getting the Giant or Trans. Really, as we go up this list and price, the only thing left to look at is these enduro bikes. So Commencal, Meta Am, YT Capra, different compromises where you are going to have to put money into the bike. They are the same price. For the Commencal, simply doesn't come with a dropper. If you want to add that, it's going to add money. But technically, if you're riding really aggressive enduro, you don't actually need a dropper. You can actually ride that as it is. Just climb up, slam it down with your Allen key, and get back on really aggressive riding. YT Capra. I should have mentioned the Commencal. We have this is the first sort of like really nice RockShox fork, a Yari, and then the YT Capra has the Zeb, so slightly superior. You're looking at 35 mil stanchion versus 38 mil stanchion. Really long forks, you're going to add some weight, but when you're doing this kind of riding, you might as well have it. And the brakes, SRAM Kodar, probably superior to most everything else on this list. And the only issue with that bike is the SRAM SX gearing, but the good thing about that is technically, the only thing that's really awful about that drivetrain is the derailleur. Everything else is sort of okay. You can work with it, but that derailleur you're going to want to put at least in NX. But I see a lot of people just going right up to GX, get a really quality derailleur on a bike like that, and then once that's sorted out, which is maybe like $200, $300 more on top of that, which is unfortunate, but then you have a really well suited spec'd bike ready to go. Perfect. And then I did a couple different things with the spreadsheet this year. There are brands where I don't know that much about them, or their availability has always been questionable to me. I don't see where to buy them online or in stores. They just seem kind of rare. I never see them out on the trail. So I added a couple of different things, as well as the cheapest model of sort of every brand I looked up. And, there's some good things in there if you want to look at these just for maybe a point of comparison. If you're looking at the spreadsheet, you're probably not spending up to that $5,000 range, but it might be a good point of comparison to see wow, Santa Cruz is still using SX on a bike that's over $3,000. That's very interesting. Oh, and this RockShox fork, 130 mil with 32 millimeter stanchions on this bike over 3K, that's pretty unfortunate. And then on the opposite end of that token, just above it, we have this intense bike that's really well spec'd. So I'm obviously not expecting you to sort of go through these listings, but I think they're just interesting as a point of comparison as far as what you're getting at these values under 3K, and how some of the same things will be still showing up above 3K, above 4K, or even above 5K. So I'm going to move on hardtails and try to do this quick. There's a lot of hardtails to go through. Just to start off, whereas with the suspension bikes, Polygon was a clear standout. When you move to the hardtails, Vitus is by far the winner, and Polygon is okay, but they kind of have a different design philosophy. It's a bit more cross-country with them when it comes to their hardtails. And I kind of want to start off with saying, as a general rule, so I think with the Polygon Siskiyou D7 being the cheapest full suspension bike that I consider to be really good, that's sort of a good, maybe something like $1,750 is a good area where you can say, let's start looking into full suspension bikes. Below that, you're making sacrifices that actually will have a pretty negative effect on your riding. So either below $1,750 or below $1,500, you want to be looking at hardtails, and just don't even look at these Diamondbacks or these really low-end Polygons. Stick with your hardtails, and you can get so many better things from these Vitus bikes around $1,500. Of course, if you're not even remotely in that area for budget, there are a variety of things. If you want to go as cheap as possible, just a usable bike in the sense that it has a 1x drivetrain and a dropper post, the Schwinn Axum from Walmart would be the best option. I don't necessarily recommend it. It has just, I can't really talk about the parts because they're not name brand parts. They're just basically Schwinn branded parts as mechanical brakes. But if that's your budget, that's your budget, and that's what I'd recommend getting over a bike that doesn't have a dropper and doesn't have a 1x drivetrain, etc. Bumping up from that, you have the Giant Talon 2 and Trek Marlin 6. If you need to, again, buy your bike in store with a dealer, if you want service and warranty, stuff like that. Giant Talon 2, Trek Marlin 6, our first direct-to-door bike will be the Polygon Xstrata 6. That's a fine deal. Bumping up a little bit more, you get the Vitus Nucleus VR. And again, these are decent bikes, but I'd almost even move past these because these are not tubeless ready. Some of them don't even have rims that are really compatible that can take a tape job well. The Vitus happens to be pre-taped, and the Polygon is at least tubeless compatible. I'm not sure if it's actually taped out the box. But also no dropper. We're dealing with quick release skewer hubs, not through axles. All these cheaper ones are coil forks. The first one that has an air fork is this Vitus Nucleus VR. And then we have a large swath of basic bikes that all kind of have basically the same spec and nothing too special. You might as well just get that Nucleus VR. And if you want to go more than that, if you can budget more, we'll bring it up to $1,100. And then we have the next tier of Polygon and Vitus bikes. And though the Polygon is a decent bike, I would definitely, with those being the same price, I would opt towards that Nucleus VRS with the boost spacing front wheel. But you can also throw in $100 more and get into the Sentier, Vitus Sentier model range. And the reason you should definitely make that upgrade is because only for that $100, boom, right away we got tubeless ready tires. And that's going to be a great way to jumpstart you into that instead of having to buy your own and then just throw away your old wire bead ones. So X Fusion fork, not my favorite fork, but considering what's below it, there's not much better. So that's just fine. It's probably comparable to the Sun Tour 32mm fork below it. And again, we have this pretty large gap, but I do want to mention the Commencal Meta HT amp. So this is a different style hardtail than what we've really seen so far. It's a hardcore hardtail. It's aggressive, has sort of enduro-like geometry. It's a $1,400 bike and has this 160mm fork, but it is coil. It's heavy and it's going to not quite have the same amount of adjustability as an air fork. But if you plan to just ride a hardtail aggressively and smash things with that 65-degree head tube angle and that 160mm fork, that's going to be your best option at this price range. And again, it's a pretty good spec, tubeless ready, no dropper, but hey, more of an enduro bike. One of the cool things, even though I'm not a big fan of Textro brakes, they are giving you a 200mm front rotor and your 180mm rear rotor. So you can tell by the spec, these numbers we're seeing, what the bike is designed for and what type of rider should be riding it. This next bike is probably my favorite hardtail on the list, probably the hardtail I would get if I was going to get a hardtail. That is the Vitus Sentier VR. So it's kind of the way the Siskiyou T7 is. This is the first bike that really does a clean sweep of my spec sheet. Totally fine drivetrain. Awesome fork. It's the first bike to be running a Marzocchi bomber. And it's the first one to be tubeless ready and have a dropper. The Giant Fathom 2 also has tubeless ready dropper. But again, so the same situation as before with the Giant Trance. Giant Fathom is great if you need to get a dealer bike for service and warranty. That fork has just had questionable reputation, if you will. Look that up, do your research before you go with that bike. But if you need to test it, see it in store, stuff like that, that'll be your go-to bike. If you're okay with direct-to-door, definitely recommend the Vitus instead. And again, we're going to hit a huge swath of poorly spec'd bikes that I don't recommend. And we'll get down to this Norco Torrent. Now, this is funny. It's an $1,800 bike. And it has this Suntour Xeron fork that is coil, a lot like the Commencal 150mm, 35mm stanchions with a very slack 64-degree head tube angle. So for the guys who are wanting a hardcore hardtail, aggressive sort of enduro-like riding, I would make a decision between the Commencal and Norco. I do like that bike, and it's very slack, but I think for the price, considering it's coil, might as well just go for the Commencal and actually get a extra 10mm of that coil fork. Salsa makes a nice little appearance here. I've ridden a lower end Salsa in the past. Has that SLX, good first bike to do that at $1,800. Nice fork, not as good as the next bike on the list, but still good for the price point. Of course, Salsa is pretty cool because you can buy it from REI, which has a, as so far as I've heard, a great customer experience. Brakes are a little lacking, and I think the biggest problem with this one is that it's so close to these much better bikes. But nice to see a brand, not just a brick and mortar brand. I mean, REI, that's a very established, certain people will have, a membership there, ways to actually save money and, get points for that bike purchase and stuff. But me personally, I'm more of a direct-to-door brand guy, and I like just getting the most banging bike for the least amount of dollars. And the Vitus and Nuke Proof definitely hit that for $1,900. These are basically from the same company. These bikes just take on a slightly different design spec. So the VRS, really good spec overall. And then for that same price, if you were maybe a bit more aggressive rider, you'd want these slightly better brakes, slightly more slack head tube, and sort of the heavier, maybe stiffer feeling Marzocchi bomber. But you are giving up the SLX derailleur that the Vitus Sentier has. So slightly weaker brakes on the Vitus. Fox float, probably a bit lighter than that Marzocchi. Can't tell you if that's going to affect stiffness that much. I don't think the average rider is going to notice it, but I would say that's just the difference between these two bikes. Kind of hard to decide between them when they're the same price. I would say if you're doing more pedaling and standard trail riding or even cross country, go with the Vitus. If you plan to mash a bit more, ride aggressively, you don't need like a perfect pedaling experience with the SLX derailleur. Just get the heavy, stiff fork and the really good brakes. That said, another option compared to that Nuke Proof for being an aggressive rider, since 130 mil, I mean, if we're talking aggressive riding, not that much travel. Well, $100 more, you get this Commencal Meta HT AM. Has the RockShox Yari at 160 millimeter and an even slacker head tube with 65. And maybe more importantly, these nice SRAM Guide T brakes with that 200 mil rotor up front. Unfortunately, even with this amazing spec, they stick with the SRAM SX. Hey, maybe if you're riding super hard enduro, you don't have as many troubles with your drivetrain, but it would be nice to swap that to an NX or GX derailleur to really complete that bike spec. And then at the end, we get a variety of good bikes and interesting different bikes. Obviously, the sort of top of the line Vitus hardtail. What an amazing spec for that price, $2,200. You're getting an XT derailleur, and the rest of the drivetrain from the chain to the crankset is going to be SLX. The fork is Fox Float Performance, and the brakes are Shimano SLX. So of course, you are getting what you pay for. It's a more expensive bike, but it's probably clearly the best spec on this list. And again, you have a nice little option with Salsa, much like the SLX version before it. If you want to go into a place like REI, not spend quite as much as that top tier Vitus, you can get a similar spec bike for $2,100 and just sacrificing brakes a little bit, but that's okay because that bike would be a bit more trail or cross country oriented anyways. And then right at the end here, I have a couple interesting bikes. Rocky Mountain Growler 50, sort of a good option for an aggressive bike. I would still recommend that, those Commencals. And then I have these two interesting carbon XC bikes. So everything else would have been an aluminum frame. These have a carbon frame, more cross-country oriented, as you can tell with the brake spec, which is not very good. No dropper, but we have some really great drivetrains. So XT for the Cannondale. And then for this brand, Viathon, which is apparently supported by Walmart. I've never heard of them. A Reddit user directed me to them. And this has SRAM GX. And both these bikes have the RockShox SID. With the Cannondale be 100 mil, and then with the Viathon it'd be 120 millimeter. So not really my forte. I won't try to talk about this too much, but if you are cross-country racing and you want to get a proper light bike so you can actually enter in some races and be competitive, these would be your best bet. And then with hardtails, like I said, there's a ton of these things. I left a lot of them off my list initially, but as time has gone on, I've kind of added a bunch. Most of them were garbage, not worth it, but you do get some cool options like this Canyon at the bottom, these Stoics. It's a really cheap $1,200 one, decent spec, but the $2,000 spec one would be a little bit better. I mean, you're getting that RockShox Pike Select, some good brakes with SRAM Guide T. But again, those Vitus, Nuke Proof, and Commensal would probably be better for the same amount of money. The only one that really stands out is this Ragley. And Ragley is actually from the same sort of warehouse as Vitus and Nuke Proof. So there's a decent $1,400 spec one, but the real prize is the $1,700 spec one, which is a perfect sort of compromise between the 1500 and 1900 Vitus, and it's actually quite awesome. So you have your standard Dior drivetrain, nice Marzocchi Bomber Z2, tubeless ready, dropper, and really good brakes. Shimano Dior brakes, really good. And then the really trick part, so they have two models, 65.5 head tube angle and a 650B 29 wheel, but the real special one is the Mbop model, Ragley Mbop 63.75. I think it's the slackest hardtail on this list. So if you really want to go into that hardcore, hardtail, aggressive enduro ride, this is the best option, and it does it at a pretty good price, a bit cheaper than the Commensals, with a really great spec. Right out the box, you're riding great spec with that. So that's my spreadsheet for budget mountain bikes in 2022. Again, this is ultimately my spreadsheet, my opinion, the way I made it. I'm trying to denote everything in regards to what other people are saying and the mountain bike industry are saying. So ultimately use this as a guide. Try to look at the industry trends, see what parts you're seeing in certain price ranges. When do those parts disappear? When do those parts show up? And that should show you kind of where the values lie. When a part is a good value, when a part is a really bad value, like you see on this Santa Cruz Tallboy. We've been looking at things like SRAM SX and RockShox Recon all the way from $1,800. So maybe it's not a really good thing if we're seeing it above $3,000, but hey, some people just want that really good frame and they're going to upgrade from there. So this is linked in the description below. You'll see it pop up every now and again on the mountain biking subreddit. Also, if a bike that you know of is not on here that you'd like to see on here, comment with that. And if you want to see another part on here, I might add another part, but I think we're kind of good at where it is. What this is really trying to do is show you some of the most expensive parts of the bike, and then you look into all the fine details like the frame geometry and what grips and pedals and saddles and tires it might be running. So if you have any questions, throw them in the comments. And if you want a bike review on the Vitus Mythique VR and the Polygons Siskiyou T7, go into my backlog on my channel, and I've reviewed both those bikes and done sort of riding videos